This stuff will make sense in the end. Face.
Hey guys, it's Eric Weingart with Weingart Racing. You just saw a video and it was a dyno pool. And the reason why I have that one on there is because this video is titled Justification. Because you probably heard in many of my videos, I said that the S10 has a 350 small block Chevy in here that makes 650 horsepower. You just saw the dyno runs. And several of you right now are going back and looking at the numbers and saying, no, that didn't make 650 horsepower. What I showed you there was the dyno run, and that was from 5,500 to 7,800 RPM. And those numbers you see on the screen are uncorrected, which means that's exactly the horsepower that that engine made, not correcting for air factors. And I know some of you are all thinking that don't have any experience with dynos, but here's the way they work. You put your engine on there and it's got a strain gauge, and it measures how much that strain gauge moves, and that tells you how much force it took to move it. And then that computer calculates a number and says, this is your horsepower and this is your torque. Then things get more complicated. That's the uncorrected number that you get. From that point on, different dynos have different correction factors, and there's so many other little pieces that make those numbers jump up. And for instance, if you look at that screen and off to the side when you saw it, so you might have to go back and rewatch, it'll show a correction factor of 1.07 because it had the weather data on that sheet, which means if because of the heat, how hot it was, and the humidity in the air, it's saying really if this engine was at sea level and it was like 66 degrees and the barometric pressure was a certain point, you should correct up, according to that, I think it was 7%. So if you took the raw numbers and then you corrected up 7%, you would have got not 650 horsepower still. It would have got about 580 or so. And you might be like, well, then where does the 650 horsepower come from? Because you say it all the time. Superflow and other dynos do this too. They have different correction factors that they'll also add in besides the weather. So they're going to say, hey, this engine really, even though that's the raw number, this corrects for the air, that's the air correction. But you know what? It did take some energy to actually turn the dyno, and that's causing the engine to lose some power. So we're going to add some frictional horsepower, or inertia horsepower loss, and frictional horsepower loss, and add those into the correction factors, and then it brings the number up even higher. And in the end, from this dyno, it showed 650 horsepower. And I'm going to show you the dyno sheet in just a minute so you don't think I'm feeding you bull. But that's what that one says. Now, do I think this truck will ever show 650 horsepower? No. The problem with dynos, and I'm just trying to save to get one, but I'm not trying to use it for the same purposes of many others. The problem with dynos is they're so varied. You know what I mean by this? I could have taken this engine to 5 dynos in this area, and none of them probably would have gave me the same number. None. So the uncorrected, probably. They would have been pretty close. The corrected, no. And even some of the uncorrected, I could see that actually being higher too. And I'll probably make a whole another video on how you can jack up dyno numbers. Now, you might say, what's this got to do with anything? Why are you even telling us this? Because when we look at the ET, and one of the things that people said the most is, hey, your truck's only showing like 500 horsepower, man. It's not showing 650. I'm not trying to lie to you. That's legitimately what the dyno sheet said. However, I always record dyno runs with the uncorrected numbers. And the reason why is because that number is closer to what the truck will actually show. And if you look at the dyno running, it showed about 522 uncorrected, and it was kind of warm. So the truck should make about that. And I'm about to show you another dyno ET to horsepower correction factor that kind of shows it's pretty close. Not exact, but pretty close. Still not 650 horsepower. Granted. But here's the thing. That number that we get, the truck, and this is where a lot of us make a mistake, including myself. We focus just on that engine. That's the only thing we care about for most people, is like the horsepower comes from the engine, forgetting this whole package that it's in that can affect it. And what I mean by that is when the engine first went in, I had different headers from what was used on the dyno, and I had a full exhaust system. and it went 1162 at 118. It didn't even show close to 500 horsepower. It showed closer to 400. Now, granted, the headers and stuff will probably lose it. Well, as things progressed, it got a little bit quicker. That's just the exhaust system. All of us are guilty of that. Usually we try to run some exhaust system. I promise you it's not the same one that you usually use in the dyno. Some people do, but most don't because they won't fit the dyno console. In other words, your headers come too close together, they actually hit the dyno and you can't run them on the dyno. Also, some places don't have the room for you to put long mufflers and show all the stuff that you would actually run in the vehicle. The other thing that affects it too is, so if we just focus on the engine, this whole vehicle is trying to take power away from that engine. So gears, the tire itself, that's why we looked at slick versus radial. Did the engine make any more power when I switched from a slick to a radial? No, it made the same. The only difference was the radial took less power away from the engine, hence its mile an hour looked better. Focusing on the chassis should be a thing that all of us focus on. Because again, we are so focused on that engine for horsepower. And I'm a head porter, so I can totally say that. We focus on just that when you could put that nice engine in a horrible chassis with things that are totally mismatched for that engine and make the engine look horrible. So for instance, this is now a Power Glide. The Turbo 350 actually showed more, it actually went quicker with the Turbo 350. However, it shifted so slow because the shift kit was bad. What if I had put in, even worse, what if I put in a 3500 stall converter? Think how much slower this truck would be. Because after all, if you saw the dyno thing, it makes peak torque at 6100 RPM, which means if I put in a 3500 stall converter on here, this thing's gonna slow way down. And people were like, you only make 400 horsepower. It doesn't even make 5. Was it the engine or was it the chassis, the rest of the pieces? It's the rest of the pieces. So a lot of people, like I said before, we only focus on the engine. And I would encourage most of you, once you got a good piece, good engine that's running well, you've dynoed it and you know kind of what it makes, when you're at the dyno, ask them to give you the uncorrected numbers. Because chances are that's probably what you're going to see in the car. So I want to point that out. And then once you've got that and you got a good piece, focus on the rest of the vehicle to get the most out of it. Right now, even as the truck sits and we look at the ET, this is not the best it's going to be because I know some things are limiting it. And if you watched my last video, saw the data log, and you know that the torque converter is really holding this thing back. It's really only stalling at 5,600 RPM. It should be stalling at 6,300 RPM because you want it to stall all the way up like a couple hundred RPM above your peak torque. So when you let off the trans brake, it drops back to peak torque and carries it out. It's not doing that. It also needs more gear because you should be crossing the stripe, the end of the track, a few hundred RPM more than your peak horsepower, which was between 74 and 75. I should be crossing about 7,800. I'm crossing with the radial 73 and 7,000 on slicks. I'm outside of where it should be. Because of that, it's showing less speed, less ET, and it's not as good. So now these are justifications because I want to point this out just because a lot of people just focus on that, forgetting this. The engine had to go in some vehicle to show it. A lot of you want to look at Wallace Racing calculators too, and that's fine. If you look at Wallace Racing calculator, they ask you to enter the weight, your ET, and your mile an hour, and then it spits out what they think for horsepower. Now, Wallace also has another one that corrects for the air temperature itself. Also great, except for what it doesn't account for is this. Let's take this truck, right? It's a square body, right? It's got more drag, especially since I don't have a bed down, than a car. So if I put the same engine in a car that weighed the exact same amount that has less air resistance, that one's going to look like it's got more horsepower. The Wallace Racing calculator doesn't take that into account. I'm going to post probably at the end of this video 2 of the dyno calculators or ET calculators from Max Race Software. His asks you to give a frontal area, a whole bunch of different things that actually will affect it, and gives you a closer idea of what the chassis does as far as horsepower from your ET, not just weight. Then there's one other thing that I wanted to point out. Even when you look at your weather corrections, so you look at your weather correction like when I raced, it was 74 degrees. I posted the data log, and if you looked at the data log, you would see something called MAT. That's manifold air temperature. Well, that recording, because I don't actually have the sniper on, the sniper is really close to where the air cleaner is, and that's where it's gathering its air. If you look at the manifold air temperature, it's not getting 74.3 degree air. It was getting 105. So even though the weather correction says one thing, what the engine's actually breathing in isn't that. Now, of course, if you had an open scoop and it was facing forward, that would be a different story. That is not what this has. So hopefully that answers some of the questions about, well, you keep saying it makes 650 horsepower. That's it. Oh, and I know someone's going to say this. Well, that's because it's on a Superflow dyno. Stuska dynos are way tighter. They may be, but I'll tell you this. The most outrageous numbers I've ever had came from a Stuska dyno. And you're like, what do you mean? This was and I'm not making this up, it was a 350 for a circle track deal, factory stock. It had Vortec heads on it that I did some work to, but not what you're thinking. A dual plane RPM, L-Rock RPM, not air gap, RPM. It had a flat tappet cam, solid, and it had about 10.5 to 1 compression ratio. On a Stuska dyno, that thing said it made 651 horsepower. On a Stuska. It didn't, I told him when I got that, when he showed me the number, he was so proud. He was like, the heads are great. I was like, heads might be good, but it ain't that good. That's not it. He then went on to win a bunch of races. Matter of fact, he won 5 in a row, got tore down in the barn, went to the barn to see if he was still legal. He was. The engine ran perfectly, but it didn't make 650 horsepower. Dynos are so far off. You could almost say they're like flow benches, but I'll say this. Flow benches might be off, but I've never seen a flow bench off as much as the dynos from dyno to dyno. It is unbelievable. You can have them off by 100 to 200 in different dynos in the same area. So, wanted to point that out. And now, since you stuck around to the end, I want to show you this. This is an engine that's a 350 Chevy for a circle track deal. It's going to be a 2-barrel deal. We're going to dyno it on Thursday, so I thought I'd show you that. This is a pooch. It's one of those classes where circle track have the dumbest rules. But this one is 4-valve relief flat top piston, so it's maybe 10 to 1. I don't even think it's that. It's got the EQ IMCA heads. I didn't do the heads besides just refreshing them. I did spec a camshaft, but it's a hydraulic flat tappet, less than 500 lift. It's got to pull 15 inches of vacuum, and it'll have a 2-barrel carburetor on it. It's going to be a pooch, but we'll be on the dyno on Thursday. Now, last thing, because I promised you I would, I'm going to show you the dyno sheets. Here is the dyno sheet on gas. So this is on pump gas, which is exactly the way that the truck runs, just so you know. Here we are. This is the pull. Now, I should point out, he had to change this. If you notice, this maybe was some of the reason why the numbers were high. Sorry, my finger was dirty. I was pulling out a plug. Header wraps, no matter how much you do, they're still going to make a mess. That's the reason why it gets you all dirty. This is wrong. It's not that bore. He ended up changing it in the next sheet, which you'll see. He has the numbers wrong there. The only thing that might have affected might have been the inertia factor, but it didn't really change when we changed it. So it didn't seem like it made any difference as far as power-wise. That's what I'm telling you. It really just records this information. Doesn't really change this. All right, so it made, here's 652 horsepower, 7,400 RPM. And if you look at the torque, it was 509 at 61, like I said. By the way, that's more torque than Cecil's engine. Remember, his made exactly about 500, 503. That's the reason why I think the dyno was reading wrong with his on there. There's no way this 350 made more torque than his 400. This is this one. Here's what it did on methanol. Now you see it changed it to the right stuff. 672 horsepower. And then look how it jumped the torque though. 537. I know some of you are like, well, why don't you put it on methanol then? Because the way it worked was, just so you know, this Demon carburetor, I can switch back and forth to methanol. And trust me, I've thought about doing it just to see if it pick up any on the truck. The only problem is I had the Sniper system on originally, and it had the master kit, which is their paper filters and stuff, and their fuel pump. I'm about 90% certain that if I tried to run methanol through that, the pump will not work, and it's also going to chew up that filter. I'm like, well, just change them. Yeah, I'm not Moneybag McGee. I wish I was. The other thing is, This truck really could be approved with a few things, one being the converter and two being the gears. I did actually order new gears. I looked at a new converter, 1,800 bucks. And I know you're thinking when you're watching this channel, you're like, you're such a cool guy. You have all these viewers. Surely you'll get sponsors. I got 14,000 subscribers, which I am very happy about. That ain't nothing. Now, if I was a girl and washed my car in a bikini, I'd probably have over 100,000 subscribers, but you got me and I'm hideous. So, but no sponsors wants to pick up a deal like this. Like, hey, this guy's got next to no views. The only thing I could say is I probably get more people to buy stuff from my channel than others, but I don't know that that matters. It doesn't matter what I'm trying to say. So I know you're like, you would think people just want to throw in parts to make, no, they just don't. It's the truth. So anything that's on this truck, I bought it. So there is no sponsorship deal. I don't know. I think people, because several people have commented like, I'm surprised people don't give you stuff. They just haven't, not yet anyway. So anyway, there you go. Thanks for watching. Take care.
Leveled off, but it carried it for a long time.